Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on history, and today we are talking about time and history. In the earlier version of this lecture, in fact this is a sequel to what we discussed earlier as part 1 of this, and it would be better that you take a listen to what we discussed in the first part to make a better sense in terms of continuity as to what we are going to talk about. Because what we have discussed so far is some definitional aspect of time from the natural sciences, from physics perspective and so forth, measurable quantity and visualization as mental impression, psychological impression and so forth, and its pertinence to history writing, and particularly Indian history writing, modern Indian history writing that began at the behest of the colonial historians, the British administrative historians, who started to look at India's past in a different way altogether from 19th century onwards or the last quarter of 18th century onwards. And this was also on account of their own you can say cultural notion of time that they had come with. And that is what I was talking to you in the earlier part of this discussion, that the Christian or European notion of time was not far from being absurd. And that is even as late as say 17th, 18th century, they had been there were residues of this kind of understanding about time, which was biblical time, and that told them, to the Europeans in general, that the origin of earth is not more than 4,000 years prior to the birth of Christ, right? And in the 19th century, in the middle of 19th century, and even prior to it, there were several scientific assertions across the 17th and 18th century which had completely jettisoned this biblical notion of time. And although it was linear, all right, but the sheer magnitude of time that they were dealing with was very small, and they had to be done away with, right? But it is right at this juncture, it is right at this conjuncture that Britain started ruling over India. It is in this intellectual firmament of ambivalence about their own philosophy of time and so forth that they had come to encounter a community, a civilization that operated with quite possibly other notion of time. Right, and the way they trumped it up, like all Indians or the Oriental societies that are not so developed operate with. So India became some kind of an icon, emblem of representing primitive societies that operated with a different notion of time, which was cyclical. Now this is labeling at its best, right? And we will see, we will discover as part of this discussion as to what we are talking about. And so continuing from the earlier discussion, I would like to little bit tell you about the backdrop, and that should allow us to deal with the other part of this lecture better. So the biblical notion of time that I was talking to you about, with which quite a few of the British administrative historians were very much socialized, although science and scientific developments across 17th century had completely given a very fatal blow to this notion, but there were some administrative historians, James Mill included, or for that matter, we will see there were several people who are still trying to somehow resurrect that biblical notion of time by citing evidence from ancient Indian sources, right? And that is what makes this story a little bit paradoxical, right? So the future end of this biblical chronology that I was talking to you about, that 4,000 year thing, was to be replaced by an open future with the coming of the French Revolution, because French Revolution was iconic. French Revolution was radical. French Revolution, at least the radical part of the French Revolution, told to the world that past was of no relevance to the future, because the future was so new, right? And since the future was very new and they did not have a blueprint of future, so any kind of revealed truth about future is something that didn't quite gel with the revolutionaries. And after the French Revolution, almost it was settled in Europe that this biblical notion of the anteriority of time, very short anteriority of time, and its defined future as the day of judgment and so forth, is not rational, will have to be revised and so forth. Similarly, the other part, that is the past end of the chronology, at the same time was receiving a jolt around 1860s, around the middle of the 19th century. We have Darwin's survival of the fittest and evolutionary theory and so forth. We have the emergence of geology as a discipline with very old stratigraphic sequence of rock formation and so forth, which called for a very long duration of time over which this kind of stratigraphic sequencing would have been done by nature. And certainly it could not have been fitted into that small duration of 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. So it called for a longer duration of time, and therefore biblical notion of time was just not good enough. Similarly, even in biology, fossil records told us that this process of evolution was very old, even of animals or species, and that also called for a timeline which is far bigger than 4,000 years as mandated by biblical notion. So it was in the middle of this crisis of chronology for the Europeans that they had started ruling over India, and they had started reading or getting Indian ancient scripts translated for their own understanding of past. And this crisis of chronology of Europeans accompanied the beginning of the British rule of India, and this is important. This timing is of importance. On the Vedic side, the post-Vedic conceptualization of world, and now I'm talking of India, the post-Vedic conceptualization of world and time drew on an interaction or drew on an international circulation of ideas about astronomy, astrology, and also mathematics in ancient times to sketch a vast arc of time through different scales of being: humans, ancestors, gods, creators, and the Manu, right? So Manu Smriti gives us a very detailed philosophical and also quantifiable understanding of time, and the the hugeness, the mammoth timeline that had been visualized in ancient Indian texts. So this particular slide, as you can see on your screen, for humans in the Manusmriti, we have Yug, which spans over 12,000 years. We are including all the 4 yugas, right? Krit, Treta, Dwapar, and Kali Yuga, right? Then this is only for human beings. So this is human time, right? Then there is visualization of time at a different level altogether, and that is the time of gods, and they operated with a all the more bigger unit of time, and that is Mahayuga. So one Mahayuga would be 12,000 years, that is human yuga, multiplied by 360, that is one yuga of humans is equal to 1 day of God, and therefore it had to be multiplied by 360, 360 being understood as the total number of days in a year. So that would give you the human magnitude of what actually was God's time, God's Mahayuga. And then we have Brahma, right? Kalp, which is 4.32 thousand million human years, right. So, then we have Manu's time, that is Manvantar, and Manvantar would be 71 Mahayug, right. So, if you break it down to human time, Krit Yug would be of 4800 years, Treta Yug would be of 3600 years, Dwapar of 2400 years, and Kali Yug of 1200 years, and this totals to 12,000, and that is the calculation that we have done in the earlier slide. So, what we find is that in India, these British administrative historians encountered a more complex and more mammoth, more big magnitude of time with which people are dealing with, or people were dealing with, and it was not on one plane. It was not only with human time that they were visualizing time. They had different different grade, and each grade had a different magnitude, right. So, in Manu's account of time, each grade of being has its own periodicity, and this periodicity is also expressed very interestingly. I am not getting to the details. For example, for human day, it would be like when the sun sets and the sun rises. So, it would be like when there is darkness, when there is light. And then when you move to another scale, it would be like the fortnight of full night and full moon, and the other half being when there is no moon, right. So, there is fair degree of ambivalence of the Indologists with respect to the Puranic king lists, and remember, we know that to begin with, these administrative historians actually got hold of the Pandits and the Maulavis who were present at that point of time to translate as many texts for their convenience, ancient Indian texts, or even several texts belonging to the medieval period. For example, Farishta's work on history of India was one of the earliest that they got translated with the help of some Maulavis, right. And of course, that had its own perils. They did not know Indian language, and a translated version of an ancient or medieval text carries its own peril so far as making an understanding about the subject population is concerned. So, on the one hand, it appeared nothing more than fable to them. So, these huge numbers that we are talking of, Kalp and Manvantar and so forth, they thought that this is just a human, human play, or they are just playing with numbers and that's it. So, it's nothing more than fable. So, at one level they are discounting it, right. These Oriental scholars are discounting it as nothing more than a fable, and they are denying any historicity to this. On the other hand, the likes of William Jones relied on the Puranas to deliver true, reliable, outside confirmation of the biblical narrative, especially of the flood of Noah, because that is something that was critical in their conceptualization of time as the day of beginning and the judgment day and so forth. And this is something that is true of all the Semitic religions, right. So, as I told you in the earlier part of this discussion, that there is this ambivalence in this period where some of these European scholars are still sticking to the biblical notion of time, although as a consequence of several developments like scientific revolution, enlightenment and so forth, Europe itself was revising, or Europe itself had done away with the biblical notion of time, also as a result of Reformation and so forth. But there were adherents of the biblical notion of time. It was somewhere there in their mind, and they read India's deep history with the intent to resurrect the tottering biblical narrative in Europe. right? This is something that usually usually doesn't get emphasized in the kinds of history that we read about. So for Jones, you'd be surprised to know that Sanskrit literature and the Puranas served as independent testimony for the rational defense of Bible story, of deep history, against skeptics like Voltaire. We all know of Voltaire. Voltaire is an enlightened scholar, right? And his centerpiece is rationality. He would not buy the argument of a biblical narrative of time, right? But in Europe, there is something going. There are some adherents who still held on to the biblical notion of time, and they are still furnishing evidence from outside Europe, citing it as independent testimony by which the biblical notion of time could be held to be true. Now, this is very interesting. So, you'd be surprised to know that there is a huge statue of William Jones in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and on the base of the statue are carved emblems drawn from the Puranic study of the flood. Now, that flood of the Noah is equated with evidence from Puran, and it is sought to be said that, well, look, a deep history of India also reveals something of that sort which is written in Bible, and therefore what is written in Bible is credible, right? In India, they are refuting it. They are saying that this is this huge time span that they are talking of, Kalp and so Manvantar and so forth. So this is huge. This is nothing more than a fable. But in their own continent, they are doing something else with it, and that is what paradox is all about. That is what ambivalence is all about, and one has to come to terms with this. Jones, therefore, had made Hinduism safe for Anglicans. This is, of course, this is a sarcastic remark that Trotman has made, and I am quoting him. Jones had made Hinduism safe for Anglicans because Hinduism had provided a proof text to make Christianity safe from Voltaire. Now, of course, we all know that ultimately, eventually, it is Voltaire who wins. It is rationality that wins. It is enlightenment that wins, and not the biblical notion of time or revealed truth. But for the moment, the way Puranic information was used in England, it is to that effect, right? So, in the midst of this clash of chronologies of Europe and India, emerged the charge of the absence of historical consciousness in early India, right? And it is this that we are now coming to, because the Indologists who otherwise spoke of, virtues of Indian civilization on one side, and used the imagery of India or imagery of the Orient in order to establish their own distinctive character or distinctness as the Occident, as the other, right? So Orient is the other, and Europe or Europeans are different from the Orient, right? So it's a kind of negative image of what Europe was and stood for. It stood for progress, whereas the Oriental societies were still mired in say past and very slow pace of development, devoid of development, almost stagnant, right? Now, Mircea Eliade has written about some fundamental assumptions about time in early India, and that is very important for us to understand. We all know that quite a few of the texts that the British administrative historians laid their hands on, and they would talk about the eternal cyclic repetition of time, right? So it is about the cyclic time that we are talking of, and cyclic time, of course, would negate quite a few things that were understood as historical in linear notion of time. So, Mircea-Eliade says that one of the fundamental assumptions about time in earlier India was, number one, an eternal cyclic repetition of time, so huge in concept that human activities became minuscule and insignificant in comparison. So, the timeline was so huge with which Indians operated, ancient Indians operated, that human span of life became so small in that big canvas that it was inconsequential. And since it was, human life was inconsequential, therefore, you can say the quotidian concern or the mundane concern of human life could never enter historical accounts, and therefore in Ved or in Upanishads or in Dharma Shastra, Dharma Sutras, these are mostly the kinds of texts that Europeans are reading about India's past, and they don't talk much about human timeline. They are not talking much about dynastic change. They are not talking much about economic changes. They are not talking much about technological changes. They are talking about big cosmic time and so forth. And this is what is the observation of Mircea-Eliade. Second observation as the fundamental assumption of ancient Indians by Mircea-Eliade is cyclic time is continuous without a beginning or an end, and therefore, if it is without a beginning, so it is bottomless, and hence obviously it would be at odds with the date of creation or the date of judgment of Semitic tradition. So, Islam and Christianity included, right. So, even since Hinduism before the British started or the Europeans started reading about it in India's past is mediated by good 700-800 years of rule by rulers who mostly were affiliated to Islam. And Islam also is a Semitic religion, and there is a fair degree of closeness in terms of their visualization of time with respect to the Indian notion of time, right. And therefore, it did not gel well with the cyclic notion of time, right. Cyclic notion of time is continuous and it is without a beginning or an end. So, they must have found it a little bit at odds with what they had visualized as time. So, the third assumption is that the cycle returns with unchanging regularity and in unchanging form. It negates uniqueness to events, and therefore, it amounts to refusal of history. And this is at the bedrock of this charge that the Europeans are making, that James Mill is making, that several other Oriental scholars are also making, that ancient Indians did not bother to write about India's past because their lifetime and their role in history doesn't enter into their historical accounts because they were operating with a cyclic notion of time altogether. Now, we know that Kal, which is the root word is Kal, which simultaneously means to calculate, it simultaneously means to destroy, and therefore conceptualization of time as an agency of destruction. So, there is negative eschatology that is at work. And historians like now Indian historians like Romila Thapar and several others have of late started refuting this charge that ancient India did not have historical consciousness, because they blame it on the Oriental and colonial historians, colonial writers, who displayed this tendency of stereotyping cyclic time as the sacred time, since it was the mythical time, to non-monotheistic religions, while ignoring the evidence of other categories of time in history of their societies is typically born of colonial concerns. So, this kind of labeling, this kind of stereotyping is deliberately done on account of colonial concerns, on account of deliberate projection of India's history as Oriental, backward, and so forth. Because if you look at several other evidence, for example, if you look at the epigraphic evidence, Ashokan inscriptions or Rudradaman inscriptions or several other inscriptions, or if you look at the Jaina sources, if you look at the Buddhist sources, there is fair degree of allusion to or they allude to human time, or for that matter even the Purana. They may not give you a very historically faithful account of past, but they are very much concerned with human time. They are even falsifying their genealogies to derive some kind of a legitimacy for their rule. And this is again deliberate. The concern is very mundane. The concern is political. The concern is ideological. These are mundane issues. So in ancient India, people did engage with mundane issues and wrote accordingly, right? But these texts were not studied, and this was not inadvertent, as these historians would now tell us, that this was deliberate, because they had a particular projection to make. They had to embellish the European projection in contrast to its negative imagery in the form of Oriental societies, right? And therefore, this charge of ancient India not having historical consciousness is born out of this kind of faulty historical perspective, or faulty clash, or you can say clash of chronology and so forth, the ambivalences we have already spoken of. So that is it that I wanted to share with you with respect to time and history, particularly modern Indian history writing that began at the behest of the colonial scholars. Thank you.